Hi. So, I've been thinking a lot lately about a particular verse. Um, and we'll get to that verse in a minute, but I want to give you an illustration first. Imagine, if you will, your church, the auditorium, that you go to every Sunday morning and have worship service. Imagine that you have the guy that's up front, whatever you call him, the minister, the pastor, the priest, up front. And for the purposes of this illustration, we're just going to call him the priest, whether that's what you call him or not at your church. Then imagine all the people sitting in the rows are not just everyday people. They're all priests. Row after row after row of priests. Nobody else, just priests. And the priests start attending this church when they're very young, say 18. And they go to this church and they all sit there in the rows (50, 60, 70 years until they die. And only the one priest that is up front ever delivers the sermon. Would you say that this is a little bit ludicrous? That this is kind of a waste? You know, depending on the size of the auditorium, you have 500 priests sitting there, but they don't ever act like priests. They don't ever do anything. All they do is listen to the other priest that's up front, the one priest that's allowed to talk. Think about that for a second. 500 priests that don't act like priests. So, let's take a look at the verse I've been thinking about. Revelation 1:6. And he has made us to be a kingdom, priests to his God and Father. To him be the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Now, this verse is part of the message that John was told to write to the 7 churches of Asia. Not to the clergy of the 7 churches of Asia, not to the pastors of the 7 churches of Asia, not to the elders of the 7 churches of Asia, but to the churches as a whole. Every single person that goes to those churches. And he says he's made us to be a kingdom, priests to God. So every single person that went to those churches, and by extension, every person who considers them a Christian, considers themselves a Christian, considers themselves a follower of Jesus, you're a priest too. And yet, you're spending 50, 60, 70 years, maybe only 20 years, maybe 10 years, depending on how old you were when you came to know the Lord, but you're a priest and you're spending your entire life not acting like a priest. And this isn't an isolated verse. In Revelation chapter 5, verse 10, the same verse is repeated pretty much word for word. So what do we do with this? How are we supposed to be priests if all we do is sit in a row and listen to the priest up front, or the pastor, or the minister, or the reverend, or brother so-and-so, whatever you want to call him? What do we do with that? You've heard me talk about this before. I love 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And we're going to read 26 to 31. Paul's been talking about gifts of the Holy Spirit, specifically speaking in tongues. But now he broadens it out a little bit. What is the outcome then, brethren? When you assemble, each one has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation. Let all things be done for edification. If anyone speaks in a tongue, it should be by two or at the most three, and each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there is no interpreter, let him keep silent in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God. And let the 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others pass judgment. But if a revelation is made to another who is seated, let the first keep silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all may be exhorted. Now, which makes more sense with the example that I gave you? Which lines up perfectly well with Revelation 1 and 6 and Revelation 5 and 10. We are all priests. So you have this auditorium full of priests, but only one's allowed to talk. Or you have a room full of priests, and as it says in 1 Corinthians 14, each one has something to contribute. Each one has something to say. Everyone is a priest, and everyone is used to deliver the message of the Holy Spirit to each other. Nobody gets to just sit silently. And if one of them is speaking and the Holy Spirit gives something to another one, they stand up and the first one sits down. Try telling your pastor that it's time for him to sit down. Try telling your priest that it's time for him to sit down. I don't think you'll like the reaction you get, but this is what 1 Corinthians 14 says should happen, and it lines up pretty well with the book of Revelation. So are you going to go with Paul, what he taught the Corinthians, and John, what the Holy Spirit directed him, what Jesus told him to tell the churches of Asia? Are you going to go with your tradition and what your pastor or priest or minister has taught you? I am going to go with what's in this book. How about you? Do you really believe what's in the Bible? I'll see you next time.